Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The first day at St. Mary's General Hospital. Angela Parker stepped out of her car and gazed at the imposing structure of St. Mary's General Hospital. Its pristine glass facade glinted in the morning sunlight, a beacon of medical excellence nestled in the heart of a suburban community. A knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach, but Angela smoothed her navy blue scrubs and steadied her breathing. Today was a big day, her first at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the state. As a talented and experienced nurse, she knew she was more than qualified, but the stakes here felt different. The lobby was bustling with activity. Doctors in white coats strode with purpose, patients waited with a mix of hope and worry, and nurses managed a delicate balance between efficiency and empathy. Angela joined the crowd, her dark brown eyes scanning for the nurse's station. She adjusted her shoulder bag and approached a cluster of staff members, gathered around a desk. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady, despite the flicker of unease in her chest. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. Could someone point me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse with a high ponytail glanced up. Her icy blue eyes lingered on Angela for a beat longer than necessary. "Down the hall," she said coolly, her tone devoid of warmth. "Third door on the right." "Thank you," Angela replied, forcing a polite smile. As she made her way down the corridor, she couldn't ignore the stares or the muted whispers trailing in her wake. She reminded herself why she was here, to make a difference in patients' lives. She wouldn't let the weight of judgmental gazes chip away at her resolve. At the head nurse's office, Angela knocked lightly before stepping inside. A petite woman in her 50s with short silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes greeted her. "Angela Parker," she said, standing to shake Angela's hand. "I'm head nurse Helen Carter. Welcome to St. Mary's." "Thank you. I'm honored to be here," Angela replied, appreciating the warmth in Helen's handshake. Helen gestured for Angela to sit. "I've read your file. You have an impressive background. I'm confident you'll be a valuable addition to our team." Angela felt a small wave of relief. "I'll do my best to meet the hospital's standards." "Good," Helen said briskly. "Now, let's go over your responsibilities and introduce you to the staff." The orientation lasted an hour, during which Angela learned about the hospital's protocols, patient demographics, and the challenges of working in such a fast-paced environment. Helen led Angela through the maze-like corridors, introducing her to doctors, nurses, and support staff. Some offered polite smiles, others barely acknowledged her. Angela noted the subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of discomfort from certain colleagues. It wasn't new to her, but it was disheartening nonetheless. As they reached the general ward, Helen stopped at the bedside of an elderly man. His silver hair framed a kind face, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that spoke of years of hardship. A clipboard at the foot of the bed identified him as Thomas Edwards. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Helen greeted him. "This is Angela Parker, one of our new nurses. She'll be part of the team taking care of you." Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes locking with Angela's. "Nice to meet you, Nurse Parker." "Likewise, Mr. Edwards," Angela replied warmly. "I'll do my best to ensure you're comfortable during your stay." Helen excused herself, leaving Angela to familiarize herself with the ward. She noted that Mr. Edwards's room was filled with flowers and cards, suggesting he had a loving family. Yet, his demeanor carried a quiet intensity, as if he observed and absorbed far more than he let on. As Angela made her way back to the nurse's station, she overheard snippets of a conversation. "Did you see the new hire?" one voice whispered. "Yeah. Don't know how long she'll last," another replied. Angela ignored the comments, focusing on organizing her supplies and preparing for her shift. She wasn't here to win popularity contests, she was here to care for patients. Later that morning, Angela assisted Dr. Richard Collins, a seasoned physician with an imposing presence, during a routine patient consultation. Dr. Collins exuded confidence but had a reputation for being demanding. Angela worked efficiently, anticipating his needs and ensuring the patient was comfortable. As they finished, Dr. Collins turned to Angela. "I'll admit, I wasn't expecting much from you," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "But you handled yourself well." Angela stiffened. "Thank you, doctor. I strive to meet the needs of every patient." Dr. Collins smirked. "Let's see if you can keep up. This hospital isn't for the faint-hearted." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Angela administered medications, updated charts, and comforted patients. Despite the challenges, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. But as she clocked out, the weight of her colleagues' skepticism hung heavy on her shoulders. Back at home, Angela collapsed onto her couch, exhausted but determined. She thought of Mr. Edwards's kind eyes and the patients who relied on her. They were her motivation, her reason to persevere. She wouldn't let the biases of others dictate her worth. What Angela didn't know was that Mr. Edwards had noticed far more than she realized. Beneath his unassuming demeanor lay a story that would soon intertwine with hers in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Angela woke the next morning, determined to focus on the reason she became a nurse, to help people. She prepared for her second day with purpose, her scrubs freshly ironed, her stethoscope hanging neatly around her neck. Despite the chilly reception she had received from some of the staff, Angela reminded herself that her skills and dedication spoke louder than prejudice ever could. Upon arriving at the hospital, the morning bustle was already in full swing. Angela greeted the receptionist with a polite smile before heading to the nurse's station. The air seemed thicker with tension today, and Angela noticed Dr. Richard Collins standing at the station, flanked by two other doctors. His commanding voice carried over the sound of beeping monitors and shuffling papers. "Morning," Angela said, placing her bag beneath the counter. Dr. Collins glanced her way, his expression unreadable. "Nurse Parker, I hope you're ready. We've got a full schedule today, and I expect no errors." Angela nodded, meeting his gaze with calm professionalism. "Always, doctor." As she began organizing the charts for her assigned patients, she overheard snippets of a conversation nearby. "She seems competent," one doctor said quietly. "Competent doesn't mean she belongs here," Dr. Collins muttered in response. Angela's hand froze for a moment before she continued her work. She knew better than to let comments like that derail her focus, but it still stung. She busied herself with preparations for the day, determined to prove, yet again, that her place in the hospital was earned. The morning passed in a whirlwind of tasks. Angela administered medications, assisted patients with mobility exercises, and recorded vital signs with precision. Mr. Edwards, her elderly patient from the previous day, had become her first stop. She found him sitting upright in bed, flipping through a worn paperback book. His smile was genuine when he saw her enter. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela greeted, pulling a chair to his bedside. "How are we feeling today?" "Better now that you're here," he said, his tone light-hearted. "You have a way of brightening this place, Nurse Parker." Angela chuckled. "Flattery won't get you out of your physical therapy, but it's appreciated." The two talked as Angela checked his vitals. Mr. Edwards shared stories about his grandchildren and how he missed playing chess with his eldest. Angela enjoyed his company and found solace in their brief conversations. Yet, beneath his kind demeanor, there was an air of mystery about him, as though he carried secrets he wasn't ready to share. Later that day, Angela found herself assigned to assist Dr. Collins during a complex procedure. The patient, a middle-aged woman with a heart condition, required constant monitoring while Dr. Collins performed a delicate diagnostic test. Angela's role was crucial, tracking the patient's vitals, administering medications, and ensuring the environment was sterile. The procedure began smoothly, but midway through, the patient's blood pressure dropped suddenly. Angela immediately noticed the change on the monitor. "Doctor, her blood pressure is falling," Angela reported, her voice steady. Dr. Collins frowned, glancing at the monitor. "Increase the dopamine infusion," he ordered. Angela acted swiftly, adjusting the 4-drip with practiced precision. Within moments, the patient's vitals stabilized. Dr. Collins completed the procedure, his movements controlled but brisk. When they finished, he turned to Angela. "You handled that well," he admitted grudgingly. "Thank you, doctor," Angela replied, masking her surprise. Praise from Dr. Collins was as rare as a blue moon. Despite the moment of acknowledgement, Angela could sense the tension lingering. As she cleaned up the room and prepared the patient for transfer, she caught Dr. Collins speaking to another doctor in the hallway. "She's competent, but let's not get carried away," he said dismissively. "Competence doesn't mean she's a fit for this environment." Angela's jaw tightened, but she refused to let his words sink too deeply. She reminded herself of the patients she cared for, people like Mr. Edwards, who relied on her unwavering dedication. They were why she endured. The day wore on, and Angela found herself drawn back to Mr. Edwards's room during her break. She knocked lightly before entering, finding him still engrossed in his book. "You're popular today," he teased. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Angela smiled, sitting in the chair beside him. "Just thought I'd check in." "How's the book?" "Engrossing," he said. "But I can't help wondering about something else." "How's the staff treating you?" Angela hesitated. "It's been a mixed experience. But I'm here for the patients, not the approval of my colleagues." Mr. Edwards nodded thoughtfully. "You're stronger than most, Nurse Parker. Keep your head high. Sometimes, the ones who doubt you the most are the ones who need to see you succeed." His words lingered with Angela as she returned to her duties. The afternoon was a blur of patient rounds and chart updates. Just as her shift was about to end, a call came through about an emergency in the ICU. A young boy with a severe allergic reaction had been admitted, and the team needed all hands on deck. Angela rushed to the ICU, finding chaos as doctors and nurses worked to stabilize the boy. She jumped in without hesitation, assisting with the intubation process and ensuring the correct dosages of epinephrine and antihistamines were administered. Her calm demeanor and quick actions impressed even the most skeptical of her colleagues. When the boy's condition finally stabilized, a collective sigh of relief filled the room. Angela stepped back, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Dr. Collins, who had overseen the emergency, approached her. "Well done, Nurse Parker," he said curtly. "You've proven yourself today." Angela nodded, too exhausted to analyze his tone. She knew she had done her job, and that was enough for her. As she left the hospital that evening, Angela felt a mix of emotions: pride in her abilities, frustration at the prejudice she faced, and a growing curiosity about Mr. Edwards. His words had stayed with her all day, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. What Angela didn't realize was that her actions were being observed not only by her colleagues, but also by Mr. Edwards. As she walked to her car, Mr. Edwards sat by his window, watching her leave. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes shone with a quiet determination. Angela's journey at St. Mary's was far from over, and Mr. Edwards's role in it was just beginning. In the days to come, the threads of their stories would intertwine in ways neither of them could have anticipated, setting the stage for a reckoning that would challenge the very foundation of the hospital's culture. Angela awoke early the next day, her mind buzzing with the events of the previous 2 days. St. Mary's was proving to be a challenging environment, but she reminded herself that adversity often revealed strength. She had faced skepticism and prejudice before, and each time, she had risen above it. This time would be no different. The hospital was already alive with activity when she arrived. Nurses and doctors hurried past, their movements purposeful. Angela headed straight to the nurses' station to review her assignments for the day. As she scanned the charts, she noticed a notation beside Mr. Edwards's name: "Transfer request pending." Her stomach tightened. Was he being moved to another hospital? The thought unsettled her more than she expected. She didn't have much time to dwell on it before her first patient of the day, a woman recovering from major surgery, required assistance. Angela focused on her work, her hands steady as she adjusted 4 lines and monitored vital signs. The woman's gratitude reminded her why she loved her job. But even as she moved from one patient to the next, her thoughts kept circling back to Mr. Edwards. Later that morning, Angela found a moment to visit his room. She knocked softly before entering, finding him sitting upright in bed, his ever-present book resting on his lap. His face lit up when he saw her. "Nurse Parker," he said warmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I saw the note about a transfer," Angela said, her voice careful. "Are you being moved to another hospital?" Mr. Edwards sighed, his smile fading. "It's being considered. My condition requires specialized care, and there's talk of transferring me to a facility better equipped for long-term treatment." Angela felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "You've been a pleasure to care for, Mr. Edwards. If you do leave, the hospital will lose one of its brightest spots." He chuckled softly. "You're kind to say that. But perhaps there's a reason I've been here as long as I have. Sometimes, things happen for a purpose, don't you think?" Angela nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Edwards was speaking in riddles. There was something about him, something unspoken yet profound, that made her feel as though their paths had crossed for a reason. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Collins, who entered the room without knocking. His gaze flicked to Angela, before settling on Mr. Edwards. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," he said briskly. "I'm here to review your latest test results." Angela stepped aside, feeling an instinctive wariness. She couldn't help but notice the subtle tension between the two men. Mr. Edwards's expression remained calm, but his eyes held a sharpness that wasn't there moments ago. As Dr. Collins reviewed the chart, he began discussing the next steps in Mr. Edwards's care. His tone was clinical, almost detached, as though he were speaking about a case study rather than a human being. Angela's discomfort grew when Dr. Collins dismissed one of Mr. Edwards's concerns without so much as a second thought. "We'll proceed as planned," Dr. Collins said, closing the chart with finality. "Nurse Parker, ensure his 4 fluids are adjusted to the new specifications." Angela nodded, though she couldn't hide her disapproval. She waited until Dr. Collins had left the room before turning back to Mr. Edwards. "I'm sorry about that," she said softly. "He can be curt." Mr. Edwards shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Don't apologize for him, Nurse Parker. You're not responsible for his behavior. Besides, I've dealt with far worse in my time." Angela couldn't help but admire his composure. She adjusted his 4 as instructed and promised to check on him later. The day continued at its usual frenetic pace. Angela barely had time to grab a quick lunch before being called to assist in the emergency room. A multi-car accident had brought in several critical patients, and the staff was stretched thin. Angela's training and experience kicked in as she worked alongside the team to stabilize the injured. There was no room for hesitation, every second counted. By the time the chaos subsided, Angela was physically and emotionally drained. She washed her hands at the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her, but she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. There was still work to be done. As she returned to the ward, Angela noticed a commotion near the nurse's station. A man in a tailored suit was speaking with Dr. Collins, his voice calm but firm. Angela didn't recognize him, but his presence exuded authority. She caught snippets of their conversation as she approached. "Mr. Edwards is my client," the man was saying. "I expect his care to be handled with the utmost professionalism." Dr. Collins's expression tightened. "We are providing the standard of care appropriate for his condition." "I'm not here to debate standards, doctor," the man replied smoothly. "I'm here to ensure that my client receives the respect and attention he deserves." Angela lingered at the edge of the station, curiosity piqued. Who was Mr. Edwards, and why did he have a personal representative advocating for him? The interaction ended abruptly when the man turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The rest of Angela's shift passed without incident, but the questions about Mr. Edwards lingered in her mind. She decided to visit him again before leaving for the day. When she entered his room, he was sitting by the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "Long day?" he asked, turning to face her. "You could say that," Angela replied with a tired smile. "How are you holding up?" "I've had better days," he admitted. "But I've also had worse." Angela hesitated before speaking again. "If you don't mind me asking, who was the man speaking to Dr. Collins earlier?" "He said he was your representative." Mr. Edwards's expression grew thoughtful. "Ah, that would be Mr. Nolan, my attorney. He handles certain matters for me." "Matters?" Angela echoed, her curiosity deepening. He chuckled. "Let's just say my life has been unconventional. I've learned the value of having someone in my corner." Angela sensed that he was being deliberately vague, but she didn't press further. She respected his privacy, even as her mind raced with possibilities. Who was this man, really? And why did he seem to command such quiet power, despite his unassuming demeanor? As Angela prepared to leave, Mr. Edwards stopped her with a gentle question. "Nurse Parker, do you believe in second chances?" She paused, caught off guard by the question. "I do," she said finally. "I think everyone deserves a chance to make things right, no matter their past." Mr. Edwards smiled, his eyes warm. "That's a rare perspective, and one I admire. Thank you for sharing it." Angela left the hospital that evening feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and intrigue. Mr. Edwards's words stayed with her, their meaning elusive but profound. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a patient, that his presence at St. Mary's was part of something much larger. In the coming days, Angela would learn just how true that was. The threads of her life and Mr. Edwards's were weaving together, forming a tapestry of events that would challenge the very foundation of St. Mary's General Hospital. Secrets would be revealed, alliances would be tested, and Angela's unwavering resolve would become the catalyst for change in ways she could never have imagined. Angela arrived at St. Mary's the next morning with a renewed sense of determination. The questions surrounding Mr. Edwards lingered in her mind, but she pushed them aside, knowing she had a full day ahead. However, as soon as she stepped through the hospital's front doors, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air was charged with tension, the kind that hinted at something significant brewing beneath the surface. At the nurse's station, the usual hum of chatter was replaced by low murmurs and furtive glances. Angela caught snippets of conversation as she logged into the system to check her assignments. "Heard he's some kind of big shot." "Doesn't seem like it, but apparently." Angela's curiosity deepened, but she focused on her tasks. Her first patient required careful monitoring following a complicated surgery, and she threw herself into her work. Still, her thoughts strayed to Mr. Edwards. She decided she'd check in on him during her break. When Angela finally made her way to his room, she found him seated in his usual spot by the window. He looked out at the world beyond, his expression pensive. A stack of papers rested on the small table beside him, and his hands were clasped loosely in his lap. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, her voice warm. He turned to her with a small smile. "Nurse Parker, always a pleasure. How's the day treating you?" "Busy, as usual," she replied, taking a seat beside him. "But I wanted to see how you're doing." He nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window. "It's been an interesting morning. I had a visit from some of the hospital administration earlier." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Administration? What for?" Mr. Edwards hesitated, then chuckled softly. "Apparently, my presence here has stirred up some attention. They wanted to ensure I was satisfied with my care." Angela frowned. "Does this have anything to do with your attorney?" "I overheard him speaking with Dr. Collins yesterday." "It might," he admitted. "But there's more to it than that. Let's just say my life before this hospital wasn't exactly ordinary." Angela leaned forward slightly, her curiosity getting the better of her. "What do you mean?" Mr. Edwards studied her for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I've spent much of my life building things, Nurse Parker. Businesses, relationships, opportunities. Along the way, I made my share of mistakes, but I've also learned the value of using what I built to make a difference. Angela tilted her head, sensing there was more to the story. You're being awfully cryptic, Mr. Edwards. He laughed, a rich sound that filled the room. Perhaps I am. But some stories take time to unfold. Before Angela could press further, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Collins. His expression was pinched, his usual air of authority tinged with frustration. Nurse Parker, he said tersely, glancing between her and Mr. Edwards. I need you to assist with a patient in the ICU. There's been a complication. Angela stood immediately. Of course, doctor. I'll head there now. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Collins's demeanor had been more than professional annoyance. Something about his interactions with Mr. Edwards seemed personal. But there was no time to dwell on it. The ICU demanded her full attention. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. Angela worked tirelessly alongside the ICU team, stabilizing a critical patient and ensuring every detail was accounted for. When the situation finally calmed, she took a moment to catch her breath. As she leaned against the counter, Helen Carter, the head nurse, approached her. You've been doing excellent work, Angela, Helen said, her voice low. I know things haven't been easy here, but I see the difference you're making. Thank you, Angela replied, touched by the acknowledgement. That means a lot. Helen hesitated before continuing. I've noticed you've been spending time with Mr. Edwards. I wanted to give you a heads up, there's more to him than meets the eye. Angela frowned. I've gathered that much. But what exactly do you mean? Helen glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. Let's just say Mr. Edwards isn't your typical patient. He's influential. And some people in this hospital aren't thrilled about the scrutiny his presence is bringing. Angela's heart skipped a beat. Are you saying he's in danger? I wouldn't go that far, Helen said carefully. But you should be aware. Dr. Collins, for instance, has been under pressure from higher-ups, and he doesn't handle that well. Just keep your eyes open. Angela nodded, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Later that afternoon, Angela returned to Mr. Edwards's room, determined to learn more. He greeted her with his usual warmth, but she noticed a flicker of fatigue in his eyes. You've been busy today, he observed. So have you, Angela replied, gesturing to the stack of papers on his table. What's all this? Just some business matters, he said lightly. Nothing you need to worry about. Angela sat down, her expression serious. Mr. Edwards, I'm starting to think there's a lot I should worry about. I've been hearing things, about your influence, about the pressure your presence is putting on certain people here. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. You're persistent, Nurse Parker. I'll give you that. I care about my patients, she said simply. And I can't do my job properly if I don't understand what's going on. Mr. Edwards was silent for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But what I'm about to tell you stays between us. Angela nodded, leaning in slightly. I'm not just an old man with health issues, he began. I'm a businessman. Over the years, I've built companies, mentored leaders, and, more recently, turned my attention to philanthropy. I believe in giving back to the communities that helped me succeed. When I was admitted to this hospital, it wasn't by chance. I chose St. Mary's because I've been looking into its operations. Looking into its operations? Angela echoed, her brow furrowing. He nodded. There have been concerns. Mismanagement, inequitable treatment of staff and patients, even financial discrepancies. I've been gathering information, speaking to people, trying to understand the culture here. Angela's breath caught. You're investigating the hospital? In a manner of speaking, he said. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help. St. Mary's has the potential to be extraordinary, but it's been held back by individuals more concerned with power than progress. Angela's mind raced as she processed his words. Suddenly, so much of what she had experienced, the tension, the whispers, even Dr. Collins's behavior, made sense. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice steady. Mr. Edwards smiled, his eyes softening. "You've already done more than you realize, Nurse Parker. By showing compassion, by standing your ground, by being the kind of nurse this hospital needs, you're making a difference. But if you're willing, there's more you can do." Angela leaned forward, her resolve unwavering. "Tell me what you need." Mr. Edwards nodded, his expression filled with both gratitude and determination. "Together, we'll make sure this hospital becomes the beacon of excellence it was always meant to be." Angela's conversation with Mr. Edwards marked a turning point in her time at St. Mary's General Hospital. Armed with the knowledge of his intentions and the growing awareness of the hospital's systemic issues, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and Angela was more determined than ever to do her part in helping Mr. Edwards achieve his goal. The next morning, Angela walked into the hospital with her head held high. The tension she had noticed over the past few days seemed to have thickened, as though the very walls were aware that change was in the air. At the nurse's station, she caught sight of Dr. Collins speaking with two members of the hospital's administration. Their voices were low, but the stern expressions on their faces suggested a heated discussion. Angela kept her distance, focusing instead on her assignments for the day. As she reviewed her patient list, she noticed a new addition. Mr. Edwards had been scheduled for a series of tests that seemed excessive for his condition. Frowning, she decided to check in with him before proceeding. When she entered his room, Mr. Edwards was already dressed and sitting in his wheelchair, his expression calm but watchful. He greeted her with a warm smile, but Angela could see the fatigue in his eyes. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he said. "I see they've decided to keep me busy today." Angela closed the door behind her and leaned against it, crossing her arms. "Mr. Edwards, I couldn't help but notice the number of tests they've scheduled for you. They don't seem entirely necessary." He nodded, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "It's a tactic, I'm afraid. Dr. Collins and his allies are hoping to wear me down, make me more compliant." Angela's jaw tightened. "That's unethical." "It is," he agreed. "But it's not unexpected. When you challenge the status quo, you can't expect those in power to roll out the red carpet." Angela considered his words, a spark of anger igniting in her chest. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Mr. Edwards looked at her, his gaze steady. "You've already done so much, Nurse Parker. But if you're willing, there is one thing I'd ask of you." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "There's a file," he said, lowering his voice. "In the hospital's administrative office. It contains information that could expose the discrepancies I've been investigating. I need someone I trust to retrieve it." Angela's heart pounded. What he was asking wasn't exactly within her job description, or entirely legal, but she understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Mr. Edwards, it was about the integrity of the hospital and the well-being of its staff and patients. "I'll do it," she said firmly. Mr. Edwards's expression softened. "Thank you, Angela. Be careful. Dr. Collins won't take kindly to anyone interfering." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. She spent the rest of the morning tending to her patients, all the while formulating a plan. She knew the administrative office was heavily monitored, but she also knew the hospital's routines well enough to identify a window of opportunity. During her lunch break, Angela made her move. She slipped into the administrative wing, her heart pounding with every step. The office was quiet, the usual staff occupied with a meeting down the hall. Angela found the file cabinet Mr. Edwards had described and began searching. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the folders, but she forced herself to focus. Finally, she found it, a thick folder labeled Special Accounts. Inside were documents detailing financial irregularities, instances of staff mistreatment, and evidence of systemic bias in patient care. Angela's stomach churned as she scanned the pages. It was worse than she had imagined. Before she could fully process the implications, she heard footsteps approaching. Panicking, she slipped the folder into her bag and closed the cabinet. She exited the office just as a staff member rounded the corner, offering a polite smile as she passed. Back in Mr. Edwards's room, Angela handed him the folder. His expression grew grim as he reviewed the contents. "This is it," he said softly. "This is what we need." Angela sat beside him, her voice low. "What happens now?" Mr. Edwards looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "Now, we take this to the board. They've been complicit in allowing this to happen, but with this evidence, they'll have no choice but to act." Angela felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that the toxic culture at St. Mary's could be dismantled. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Dr. Collins and his allies wouldn't back down without a struggle. The following days were a whirlwind. Mr. Edwards arranged a meeting with the hospital board, insisting that Angela be present as a witness. When the day of the meeting arrived, Angela found herself seated in a large conference room, surrounded by the most powerful figures in the hospital. Dr. Collins sat at the far end of the table, his expression stony. Mr. Edwards began by recounting his experiences at St. Mary's, his voice calm but firm. He detailed the systemic issues he had uncovered, presenting the evidence Angela had retrieved. The room grew increasingly tense as the board members flipped through the damning documents. When he finished, there was a long silence. Finally, one of the board members spoke. "This is serious," she said, her tone measured. "Dr. Collins, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Dr. Collins's face darkened. "This is a coordinated attack against me and my team. Mr. Edwards has no understanding of the complexities of running a hospital. These documents are taken out of context." Angela couldn't stay silent. "With all due respect, Dr. Collins, the evidence speaks for itself. The treatment of both staff and patients has been unacceptable. This hospital was founded on principles of care and compassion, and it's time we lived up to those ideals." Her words hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Mr. Edwards smiled faintly, his approval evident. The board deliberated for hours, but by the end of the day, their decision was clear. Dr. Collins was relieved of his duties, and a full investigation into the hospital's practices was launched. Angela felt a wave of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the work was far from over. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take shape at St. Mary's. New policies were implemented to ensure transparency and accountability. Staff underwent training to address biases, and patients were given a voice in their care. Angela became a key figure in these efforts, her dedication and compassion earning her the respect of her colleagues. As for Mr. Edwards, he eventually transferred to a specialized facility, but not before ensuring that St. Mary's was on the path to becoming the beacon of excellence it was meant to be. On his last day, he called Angela to his room. "You've been my rock, Nurse Parker," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Angela smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've inspired me, Mr. Edwards. I'll never forget what you've done for this hospital." As she watched him leave, Angela felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had come to St. Mary's seeking a job, but she had found a calling. The road ahead was still long, but with every step, she knew she was making a difference. And in the end, that was all she had ever wanted.